So imagine the scene in a room probably twice the size of that space behind me. A woman, slight, a bit like a birch tree perhaps, or a willow, with hazel hair and clear eyes, and a simple cap on her head, and a linen dress, sitting at a table, musing and writing, and being interrupted by visitors who come and seek her counsel at one of the windows to her cell, putting down her pen in order to attend Mass through the window of her cell which looks into the church, and having her maid bring her food to a third window, where she also passes her detritus to the maid to sort out. The maid is the connection with the world outside. And imagine that woman remaining in that place, in that space, for about 30 years, reflecting on these extraordinary visions which she had when she was 30, before she entered the cell, when she came to the crisis of a fever. The 14th century was a plague-ridden century, a pestilence-ridden century, as they called it. But we don't think it was the plague that she had. She was attended by her mother, and by a curate, and by her maid at that point. We don't actually know for sure that the woman who had these visions in 1373, 650 years ago, is the woman who was in a cell in Conisford in Norwich. We know there was a Julian of Norwich. There's independent evidence for that in legacies. But the manuscripts of the visions, which speak of in the first person of a woman having these visions when she's 30 years old in May 1373, those manuscripts are all much, much later. So it is a matter of conjecture that the woman who had the visions and wrote about them is the woman who is Julian of Norwich. The manuscripts say that it's she, but these are rubrics added later, which is why my book has to be historical fiction, but I think it's quite plausible. Julian has always been important to me, the shining light in a dry theology degree at Oxford many, many years ago. Unlike so many other theologians, she didn't try to organize God. And later, the subject of my doctoral thesis on her contribution to facing the ecological crisis. When in 2019 I was diagnosed with myeloma, a cancer of the blood, she stopped being the subject of my academic study and became my spiritual guide through 2.5 years of grueling treatment. I wrote letters throughout that time which reflected on how she teaches us to face pain. In a voice, I discovered, because of the pain, my own deepest, most truthful voice. And those letters were published in this book. As I came to the end of the treatment in July 2021, I heard a call to tell Julian's story with that same deep authenticity, in homage to her. In sharing something now of what Julian has taught me, I hope to show how she operates, not by working out a theology with which we can agree or disagree, but by fierce, visceral, performative encounter with her visions. In her writing, she is reliving the visions that she saw, so much so that they come alive again under her pen, inviting her readers to performative encounter, not with her, but with what she saw. If we let it be so, the encounters can transform us. And it is this transformation that I believe is needed today to face the ecological crisis that is upon us. So first, something about what she taught me about pain and blood. 8th of May 2019. Dear readers, Julian's revelations take place on a crucifix her curate is holding before her eyes as she lies, apparently dying, in bed. It is this crucifix which she sees move and speak and bleed. In her fourth vision, blood flows from the crucifix in abundance, not only over all the earth, but also down into hell and up into heaven, where Christ still bleeds for humanity. Julian thinks of all the water in the world God has made available for human use, but of the blood she sees, there is no liquor that he liketh so well to give us, for it is most plenteous, as it is most precious. Water washes us, but Christ's blood really washes us, inside and out, of our sins. I am not a good Christian. I would far rather wash in water than in blood, less sticky. And sin is a hard word to hear. But it seems to me that without a sense of sin, I mean proper moral responsibility, there can be no remorse. And without remorse, there can be no melting of the heart, no possibility of porosity to the other, of accepting help. I do not think my cancer is a punishment for my sins. Never that. Never, ever that. But I do think this. I fully share responsibility for the general mess that humans generally make of our world, cancer being a still largely unexplained part of that mess. I am sorry. I accept that I cannot, on my own, make reparation or make good. I accept help. And, this is strangely hard to write, forgiveness. Today, this is how I receive and understand and accept Julian's blood flood. There is so much water and blood in my life now. 3 litres of water to be drunk every day, phials of blood withdrawn every week from the crook of my elbow, bleeding into the cannula to ensure the nurse has found a vein to infuse the chemotherapy, and then infuse more water for hydration, and every day the recollection, sometimes through deliberate, gentle meditation, of the blood flowing throughout my body, bringing life, and also producing the cells that will harm me. Blood and water mixed like the blood of Christ, wine and water mixed in the Eucharistic chalice. They pass through my body, washing me deep inside, flowing through arteries and veins and capillaries, even into my very marrow where the cancer is active. A sacred symphony to heal my helpless self. I am made porous by humility, and I hear the symphony, and I am grateful. June. Dear readers, I resonate with Julian when she wishes to experience the pain of the Passion. I'm not writing here about some masochistic urge to be hurt, but rather the absolute revealing of the truth of myself, in extremis, nothing covered up. Julian's 8th revelation is of the last moments of Christ dying on the cross, and her encounter with him in this extreme state is so porous that her wish is granted, and she does indeed suffer the pains of the crucifixion. It is a pain worse than anything she has experienced or could have imagined before. A voice, a friendly voice, counsels her to look away from the cross and transfer her gaze straight up to heaven. But she refuses, understanding that she is looking at heaven already in the bloody, disfigured face of the dying Christ, battered and destroyed by the world he revealed himself to without any protection. I just know that this is true. We have to go through the pain, or call it fear, not over it or around it, because resurrection is here, not elsewhere. My encounter with Julian's text whilst I was undergoing cancer treatment became the encounter that I argued for in my thesis on Julian and ecological consciousness, and I will never cease to be grateful to her. As I mentioned, at the end of my treatment, I heard what only can be described as a call to tell Julian's story with the same deep authenticity I had discovered in writing the letters. Here is a taste of how I paid homage to Julian by re-seeing her visions and seeking to bring them to renewed life and meaning. From the first revelation. And now, in the light shed by the cross, I see a young woman barely out of childhood. Her eyes are fixed on me, but I do not think she sees me. Her lips are parted in an astonished "Oh!" And her eyes, in her eyes, I see intense concentration and fear, or is it awe? I understand in my heart that this is Mary as she was when she conceived, and she is, even now, receiving God into her body. I see her again, Thomas, as I speak to you, and she is looking into my eyes, and I can feel in my body the dread that she felt, and I understand it better because the visions came to birth in me, and they too are so much greater than I. In her conceiving of God, Mary was a poor creature of no consequence, as am I. Why does God come to such as we? I have so often wondered. It's why I wanted to speak my story to you. Is it because we know we are nothing? Out of nothing, something is coming to birth. Seeing Mary receive the Creator of the universe into her own body breaks open my own being to receive what is to come, not just to witness, but to receive into the heart of me all its strangeness and size, to be transformed as Mary is transformed by her receiving. So that's something of what Julian is, what she wrote, and what she did for me. But what is this ecological challenge? And how does this extraordinary power of transformative encounter that we find in Julian help? We are children of the Industrial Revolution, of the Enlightenment, of settled arable communities who learned how to adapt the environment to our needs rather than adapt our needs to the environment. We are used to thinking of our environment as something outside of us, to be arranged to our liking so as to produce what we need and want, when we want it. We are used to being in charge. The mindset that underlies this attitude towards the environment can be characterized as buffered, a concept from historian Charles Taylor, and Gestell, a concept from philosopher Martin Heidegger. Charles Taylor, argues that the buffered self emerged in the West over the 5 centuries between 1500 and 2000, the period that includes the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. The buffered self sees herself as hermetically sealed off from others, needing to create relationships as 1 + 1 + 1, rather than as a porous self who is inherently in relationship, who knows, I am because you are. Gestell is a mindset which puts nature into what Heidegger calls standing reserve, there waiting to be used with no inherent value, only that which humans confer upon it. The harm done by the buffered Gestell mindset might have been limited when there weren't so many of us and we had not much technological power. Now we are vast in number, all looking to the environment to give us what we want when we want it. And our technological power gives us the impression that we can make this happen. As the environmental historian J. McNeill has described so vividly and comprehensively, humanity has succeeded in affecting and changing every sphere of the planet: the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, the hydrosphere with dams and pollution, the lithosphere with mining, the pedosphere with farming, and the biosphere with our rogue species status, such that other species only survive if they can adapt to the human presence, for example, rats and viruses, or if we have need of them, for example, cattle and wheat. But our apparent lordship of creation is an illusion. Heidegger argues that technology, far from serving humanity's needs, is now the dominant force determining our futures. Technology is Lord of creation. The problem is not technology itself, mind, but the technological mindset that puts it in charge. This is the ecological challenge. These forces of relentless control and technological manipulation are why our planet is now betraying its fragility and roaring in pain. It is the buffered Gestell mindset that has brought this tragedy about. And as with all tragedies, it is the character of the protagonist that determines the outcome of the story. Our Gestell characters will not, of themselves, change anything. Only if we transform is there any hope of the story changing. But we are enslaved, says Heidegger. Buffered, says Taylor. Deluded rogue lords of the universe, says McNeill. Julian can help us. Her own subjectivity, her own self, was transformed by her revelations, not least because she was open to being transformed before they began. And the text she produced, because of its nature, can act on us like her revelations acted on her. Her text can transform our subjectivity in turn if we are open to it. She does it by waking us up into an active, performative response. She does not mount a theological argument with which we can agree or disagree. She offers a poetic text, as philosopher-theologian Paul Ricoeur would put it, a text that awakens and transforms by the poetic power of its language. But in order to let it do so, we have to come to her text as disciples, not as critics. We come to her text to learn, as supplicants who know our need. In so doing, like Julian, we have already opened ourselves to the possibility of transformation. Coming to a text, coming to anything for that matter, as a disciple, does not conform with the subjectivity we have inherited. So my entreaty to come to Julian as disciples, not masters of her text, and learn from her is no minor request. I am asking us to be open to a new way of being and seeing that might, just might, provide an escape route from slavery to Gestell and the possibility of our learning how to live with the earth and not harm it. Julian's way of seeing her visions is not buffered, not Gestell, but porous, responsive, interactive, above all open to her vision's transformative power. And she writes of her experience in such a way that even today, hundreds of years later, her words offer the same direct, face-to-face encounter with her visions that can transform us, as I found out for myself. So finally, but it's quite a long finally, I would like to read you my version of her 14th revelation. So I have brought it into the 21st century a bit. I hope it shows, though, how she fully participates in the vision, how her writing brings it to lively encounter with her readers, and how it speaks to our contemporary ecological challenge. The 14th revelation is in response to her deep plea to God to explain sin. In her vision, in the period of her visions, he has said to her, "Sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. She is shown no damned souls. All shall be well. But Holy Church has taught her there are damned souls, those who are not Christian, those who are Christian but do not lead Christian lives, the angels who fell from heaven, the Jews who did Jesus to death. Julian refuses to turn her back on Holy Church, but she cannot deny the truth of her visions, and the two are not the same. So she demands to be shown, she demands that God should show her how God will make all things well. And this is the vision that's sent in response to that urgent plea. It's an extraordinary rewriting of the fall. She's shown a simple tableau. A Lord is seated with a servant before him. The Lord bids the servant do something which he cannot hear. The servant runs to obey the Lord, and in his haste he trips and falls into a deep ditch. He lies there in terrible pain from his fall. But the worst pain is that he cannot see his Lord because he has fallen with his head facing the other way, and he cannot move. So he cannot see that the Lord is still regarding him with profound love. He fell from his haste to obey, note, not from disobedience. That is all Julian is shown at the time of her visions. Much, much later, and we can imagine her in her cell hearing this, she's told to look again at the visions, 15 years later. She's told to look again at the vision, to look at every detail of it, not to think about it, no, not to make something of it, but to look at it and look harder, in more detail, again and again. And that thus she would understand it, by means of her looking. And this is how I write this bit of Julian's story. I make all things well. How? Look again at the Lord and servant. Look at every detail. Learn. I watch the words emerge from my pen as I write, and the 14th revelation comes to life once more. The Lord is seated, and the servant stands before him. The Lord is seated on the ground, the earth, and the earth is dry, barren. The face of the Lord and the face of the servant are shining. They are in love with each other, this lordly squatter and the eager young man. And the Lord speaks, though still I cannot hear what he is saying. And the servant gathers himself on the instant of hearing his words and turns to do his bidding and runs in great haste and trips and falls into a deep ditch, as I had seen before. I look back up to the Lord, who is now high up above the fallen young man, like the bishop in the cathedral, but only because the man has fallen so deeply. And I can see the Lord's face, which is entirely towards the young man, and it is shining still with unchanged love and yearning. The Lord has not moved from his place on the barren earth. And I look back at the young man, and he is groaning, bruised, unable to move, and he has fallen, so his face is away from the Lord, and he cannot see the look of love on his Lord's face, and he is completely alone, body crumpled and in pain, and abandoned, believing himself unloved, deep in the ravine whence he had fallen, only because he longed to serve his Lord. Only because he longed to serve his Lord, not because he sinned. Look again, Julian. I look back at the Lord, still sitting on the earth, but so high above the servant, and now I can see into his heart, and I feel a great joy, a magnificent joy, but a waiting joy. It is the suppressed excitement of a father who knows that however much his sick child is suffering, she will be healed and made 1,000 times better when she emerges from her pain, 1,000 times better. The pain will bring her there. And so he weeps for her pain, but he is also brimming with anticipated joy. He is weeping, and yet his heart is bursting with a joy that fills the heavens as he regards his fallen servant. His pity and his joy flow from him and enwrap the servant, holding him in love even as he lies prone in pain. And I look back at the poor servant lying in the mud, moaning and weeping, unable to move, his face in the mud, turned away from his Lord, utterly unknowing. I look into him. He has not sinned. He was just in a hurry to obey. Look more closely, Julian. And now I can see into the servant's heart, and I see that his love of his Lord is unchanged. His will to serve his Lord is unchanged. But he is stunned. He does not know himself, and he cannot see his Lord. Is this sin? Servant in the mud, who are you? Look more closely, Julian. And now the servant is before the Lord once more, ready to start and do his will. The pageant is replayed. Now I see the servant is wearing the clothes of a worker, a kirtle to just below his knee, undyed linen, muddy and crusty with sweat, as though he has been labouring for a long time. Are you Adam? Are you all of us? Why are you standing so close to the Lord in your filthy rags? The Lord sits serenely on the barren earth. His rich robes are blue, fulsome and flowing, layer upon layer, fold upon fold, encompassing the Lord and falling from his shoulders to the ground, billowing all around him. His face is brown, his eyes are black and glowing. He radiates noble sobriety and delight. Are you God? Why are you sitting on the barren earth? Why are you delighted? The love ripples and flows between the Lord and the servant, filling me, its close observer, with its indestructible power. I look back at the servant. Are you only Adam? And the shining love that is between them is revealed as the love of a parent for a child and a child for her parent. Unbreakable, unconditional. You are Jesus, born of the Godhead before all ages. And you are Adam, made by God, birthing all humanity. One. And now I can hear the words of the loving Lord to his beloved Jesus and Adam, the words that Jesus Adam starts and runs to obey. I hunger. And Jesus Adam goes to bring food for his Lord, but the food has to be grown from the barren earth. And now I see the son servant on his knees with his hands in the earth, gently dislodging the hard soil, crumbling it in his fingers so the moisture comes, softening and serving the earth on his knees with no aid but his own body to bring its fertility back to life, to make it fruitful again, and the fruit is the food of God, the only food that will nourish him. And the work is long and hard and concentrated and vital, because without the fruit of the earth, God starves. And like a second player, but it is the same young man, Adam Jesus gardens the earth, but his hands are not gentle, they are impatient, and they do not find the moisture in the soil, but seek clever, quick ways of making the soil do his bidding, so it produces fruit, but the fruit is forced and has no sweetness, and the earth is suffering from being compelled to give birth to untimely fruit, too much of it, like a woman's body worn and diseased by too much childbirth. And now Adam Jesus seems to have forgotten the hunger of the Lord and is intent only upon production and more production, exhausting himself, exhausting the soil, until he falls in a swoon on his face in the mud, now poisoned by his voracious haste, and he disappears under the earth. And Jesu Adam is gently gardening still, but his calm digging does not cease, and it goes deeper and deeper still, his body aching and torn, his hands bleeding, till he has found the fruit for which God still hungers. Adam Jesu himself, lying in deep darkness, full of shame at his foolish, well-intended greed, helpless to amend. And Jesu Adam brings him forth, up into the light, and Adam Jesu is holding the hands of all humanity, all of us, I know not how, in our muddled, mistaken, lost helplessness, leading thousands upon thousands upon thousands of souls, till all the souls of the world are released into the light, their pain ended, their sight restored, and they gaze upon the loving Lord whose love has never ceased, only Adam Jesu could not see it. And Jesu Adam has felt all that pain, that shame, has gone to its source and been torn and wounded by it until he has found Adam Jesu and brought him into light. And now the gardening begins again, taken up by all humanity in imitation of Jesu Adam's gentle, unhurried tending. And the Lord eats of the unforced fruit, and at last he is satisfied. And Jesu Adam Jesu is with him, and his beloved mother Mary is with him, and all the thousands upon thousands of souls are with him, none excluded, as if they are one soul, and the rejoicing is beyond all that I can say. I marvel. Sin is behovely, but all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of thing shall be well. All, not some. All. Thank you. You have to go through the pain. It's the other side of the pain. You don't get a resurrection without a crucifixion. That's what she teaches us. Possibly. I don't know. I don't know what's ahead of us. There's every reason to be thoroughly pessimistic. Although I did hear a brilliant definition of hope from Nick Cave. Hope is optimism with a broken heart. And we have to hope. So my plea is to allow ourselves to be transformed by this encounter. It doesn't have to be with Julian, but Julian is one such powerful text. Julian's is one such powerful text that can affect this transformation, so that we simply see the world differently and treat it differently, not as its master, but as its servant, as the pre-lapsarian Adam did in the second creation story. He tended and cared for the garden. That was his job before the fall. Maybe we will have to go, but we're going through it now, for heaven's sake. Just because we're all right at the moment here and on a hill, you're better off than Westminster Abbey, incidentally, which isn't. It's parts of the world are absolutely devastated by what's happening as a result of the crisis. It's upon us. I was very faithful to Julian's text. That which I just read you is, most of it comes from the text. It's just my rewriting of it, apart from the way in which the digging happened. But that was an expression of the haste of the servant, and that's very much in the text. And in the text, there's simply a lord and a servant. We can change their gender if you like, or make them non-binary. But no, it's just Adam in her account. In the book, I do have her going to a pageant, a Corpus Christi play, because these were around in her day, and that's one of the ways she learns the stories, and also has this very visual sense, which I think feeds into the way she experiences her visions. And Eve features there because it's taken from a guild, the Grocers Guild. It's their play, and Eve definitely has a role there of great interplay with the serpent. I mean, we should ask about the serpent too, but none of the... I mean, this is an extraordinary re-seeing of the fall. There's just this running to do the will of the Father, running to do the will of the Lord, and in haste falling. That's it. I think we can safely assume it's radical. Lots of what Julian says is quite radical, that being one of them, because she's really questioning sin altogether. And the church of the day was, as far as we know, very intent on blaming the people for their sin that brought about the pestilence, which waves and waves and waves of it came, and they were blamed by the church for that, and they had to be penitent and do penitence and appease a wrathful God. And Julian says God cannot be wrath because the whole of creation, everything that is made, is held by God's love. So if his love were to end for 1 nanosecond, she doesn't use the word nanosecond, for 1 moment, it would fall. So he cannot be wrath. That's radical. And of course, in the 14th century, you had the rise of, you might call the proto-Protestants. They became known as Lollards in 1382, I think, who wanted to translate the Bible into English. They wanted to get rid of the priests. They wanted to get rid of all this hierarchy, which they thought was corrupt. They wanted to stop worshipping images. They wanted it to be a direct experience between God and the person. And you can see how Julian weaves into all of that. She wrote in English. She was a woman. One imagines that one of the reasons she said she'd go into a cell was to get away from all of that, a room of her own, like Virginia Woolf, to write undisturbed things which were dangerous. And it is also the case that the manuscripts really disappeared. So if she is the woman, this 14th, early 15th century anchorite is the woman who wrote this text, they disappeared. For 200 years, the earliest manuscripts of the long text are 1650. And it may be that they were hidden away. That's how I imagine it in the story, because they were dangerous, indeed. A lot, yes. It is striking. Now, I should just say this is my reading of Julian. We don't know what she thought other than these words that she wrote. But it seems to me it's implicit in what she says. More importantly, it's the effect her text has on us that transforms that separation and allows a porosity of encounter, and allows a sense that of interdependence and mutuality. So it's the experience of it rather than she wrote about it or made the case for it. That's really the point of my thesis. But yes, look, this Enlightenment move, of course, it brought so much that's absolutely brilliant, really, really valuable. But it also was predicated on a way of seeing the world that controlled it, and I'm afraid lots and lots of communities were included in that controlling. So the colonial move to organise peoples as well as land is part and parcel of it. And blow me down, it's those very people who really did understand how to be with the land for thousands and thousands of years without harming it in some harmonious relationship that were lost, that were destroyed. And this awful scrabbling back to try and get to that indigenous wisdom again that we're seeing in the new world. With great penitence, it's really good to see that, but you might say it's almost too late. Not least because the benefits of the Enlightenment are quite addictive. I mean, wow, water coming out, clean water coming out of a tap. McDonald's, car, they're attractive. So I don't think we should try and make these questions smaller just because we can't cope with the size of them. I think we have to grow. And so Julian, having in her mind both the teaching of Holy Church, which she wasn't going to abandon Holy Church, she wasn't a Lollard, She wasn't going to abandon Holy Church. She had this teaching, and then what she was shown in the visions are not the same. She stayed with that mutual incompatibility, and she grew. And that is what we are being asked to do now. With the enormity of what is facing us, we have to grow. Because if we just try and make it small again, well, that's the same Gestell mindset, controlling, doing something you feel helps. Of course we have to act from where we are, of course we do, but never forget the size of it. And the hazelnut vision, so this is early on, she says, I saw in the palm of my hand a little thing the size of a hazelnut, which is, as we know, small. And I imagine it unshelled, incidentally. If you go to the cell, they'll give you a hazelnut, but it's got a shell on it, unshelled, in her hand. So it's not a hazelnut, it's the size of a hazelnut, and it is everything that is made. So there you are, that fragile little thing, but it is everything that is made. How enormous is that? And she sees that it's held together by God's love. It's so fragile, she could just close her hand and kill it. And that is everything that is made, held by God's love. That's why God cannot be wroth, because if God's wrath were there, it would go. Replace the love, it would go. Not to be more comforting than that, sorry. But it's brilliant. She's making these demands of God. We should make these demands of God. We are in such a state. We have to ask. It's really important. Shouldn't be too polite. The vision, she had the vision. It happened to her. It was her in participative encounter with God and with Christ in the visions, sure. In her writings, she says again and again, this is not for me, it's for my even Christians, my fellow Christians. Don't look at me, look directly at the visions. At no point does she say, oh, this is just for me. No, she said, don't look at me, I'm a wretch, I'm stupid. She tells this great story right at the end of her book. I love this story. She says, I'd woken up the next morning. She'd had 15 of the 16 visions, and she'd had clearly a healing sleep. So it was like the crisis of her fever. And she wakes up, and there's a religious person sitting by her bed, and he asks her how she fared. And she says, I raved. And she burst out laughing. She said, I raved, and then she said, I thought the cross bled. And the religious person said, words to the effect of, that's quite serious. And she says, I'm telling you this story because if he hadn't done that, I would never have gone back to the visions. I would have dismissed them all. That gives her a kind of authenticity, doesn't it? That she wasn't looking to have visions, which is a bit of a feature of the day. She wasn't looking to have them, and when she had them, she thought they were nuts. But he said, no, you take them seriously. And so we have revelations of divine love. Thank God for that religious person, whoever it was. He's very important in my story, incidentally. He's given a starring role. So, yes, what she sees and the encounter that she has is for everyone. That's really, really important. But there is something I also hear in your question about for us, and it's something I think about a lot because I'm drawn to contemplative prayer and to silence, entering, if you like, my own anchor hold within myself, trying to tune into God, listening to God. And it is, of its nature, something that's done interiorly, and therefore I do it, or I don't. And I think there is a question for people like that, people like me, about social justice and activism. And I mean, this is an argument that's gone on forever between the ones who sit, contemplate, and the ones who act, ever since Martha and Mary. And there's a great piece in The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a manual for interior prayer, where he talks about how the actives just don't understand the contemplatives, and their role is really important too. And look what Jesus said about it. But I think it's an important question, and it's very important if that is your charism, if that is your thing, to turn to silent internal prayer, that you don't forget the context, you don't forget the world in which you are, and you certainly don't try and detach yourself from it or try and be detached from the pain of it, or say the pain is just an illusion. Yes, Julian speaks quite a bit about the motherhood of God and the motherhood of Christ, and very beautifully. And as I've understood it, the love of a mother is, actually I'm not a mother, but this is what I observe. The love of a mother is unconditional. Whatever the child does, that love does not change. And I think that's what Julian actually experienced herself as a mother. I imagine that was the case, and saw in God this little thing the size of a hazelnut. Whatever happens in it, whatever happens, the love does not change. So there's that aspect of motherhood, the nature of motherhood and the nature of God's love as she is explaining it, or just not explaining it, but describing it, experiencing it. But then there are also these wonderful and really visceral descriptions of Jesus as mother. So she talks about the mother taking the child to her breast and feeding the child. And she says, Jesus feeds us in the same way. And she talks about feeding us with his blood in the Eucharist. But she also talks about the piercing in his side. Have I got the right side? On his side, whichever side. Piercing in his side, that through that outpouring of blood and water and love, we are also nourished by Christ, as we are nourished by, or were nourished by our mothers, as mothers nourish their child. And there's also another, there are lots of passages. Another passage that just comes to mind is when a child's been bad and it's crying and it runs to its mother, and I remember watching a child doing this once, that it had done something wrong and it got told off. And it cried, and then it turned for comfort to the same person who told it off, which is his mother, which is because that's what we do. And she talks about Christ in those terms as well. That there's a certain teaching of discipline, but also unending love, unchanging love. There absolutely is, yeah. Well, there was in the telling of the story. Do you know I was more outraged by the menopause than I was by my cancer? It is so awful. And there's one of her visions, brilliant vision, it's the 7th vision. She experiences, so she's just had some searing thing, the previous vision, and then she experiences this wonderful sense of everything being absolutely fine, and God is there, and she loves God, and she's at ease in her body, and it's just wonderful and peaceful. And then the next moment, she's furious, and she's irritated, and Alice the maid is crashing around the room, and her mother's trying to do something to her, and it's hot, and her body really, really hurts. And my description of that was the menopause, my experience with the hot flush. And then it goes away again, which is what happens with the hot flush. It goes away again, and she experiences this beautiful peace again. And then that's taken away, and she has this awful wheel again, a woe rather, and then wheel, and then woe, 20 times, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And she did nothing to deserve the good stuff and nothing to deserve the bad stuff. So she just understands that is how it is, and God is there throughout all of it. So yes, I did draw on the menopause. And claustrophobia. And constipation.
Claire, that's a very good place to stop.